For 40 years, governments have quietly admitted something most of us never hear. Animal testing often fails to predict what medicines will actually do to humans. Since 1986, European regulators have said we should be moving away from it, not for ethical reasons alone, but because the science isn't giving us what we need. And yet, when you see those headlines about life-saving research, the assumption is still there, that animals in labs are what stand between us and unsafe drugs. So why does that story persist, even as the data keeps pointing somewhere else? Jeffrey Brown is an epidemiologist who advises on animal-free testing methods. This is Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. Let's join the conversation between Dr. Lieberman and Jeffrey about why the science has moved on, even if the narrative hasn't.
Jeff, good morning. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for taking some time out to be on Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
So, Jeff, we'll start off with, if there were one topic or one thing that you wanted our listeners to know above everything else that's most important about what we're going to chat about today, what would that be?
I think it's to keep in mind what people tend to find the most surprising, and that's in a very general sense. Animal testing isn't very helpful when it comes to making sure that the people who take medicines or use medical products stay safe. I'm sure we'll talk plenty more about that, but I think it's helpful for people to hear that said with confidence, and I wish more people felt confident saying it themselves.
Thanks. That's a great point to start from, because that's a narrative which I think, like you, I'm trying to change. I feel like there's this public perception, and even among many in the medical community, including doctors, healthcare providers, and certainly among many researchers, and unfortunately among many lawmakers and those on the inside, although that's changing, as you know, in part because of thanks to efforts like you and many others in the space, trying to share the actual knowledge. What does the real science tell us? It's not what the dominant narrative is. And so would you like to go a little bit deeper into that comment and to how you could be so confident about it?
Yeah, of course. I think there's a lot of assumptions about what it means when people think about animal testing. And it's important to recognize that that sort of floats in the background behind us at all times. Whenever we're talking about this, people at every level, from expert to novice, they have an opinion about this, and they maybe can't pinpoint why they have that opinion. And that's why I say, if I reflect on my career, my training, that is probably where my sense of confidence about this comes from. I come from the world of basic research, fundamental biological research. I'm a cell and molecular biologist by training, and then I was an epidemiologist for a very long time. Most people who train to become a scientist in the basic research field are training to do some really narrowly focused kind of study. So for me, cell biology was what really grabbed me early in my training. And that's simply to say that I got very interested that you could take cells from a human body or an animal body, and instead of looking at the entire animal, the full organism, you could learn some very important things by looking at very small pieces of the larger organism. And that's a full field itself. And then you can go even smaller scale than that. So it's not just the individual cells of an organism, but the actual chemical reactions that are happening in each of those cells. That's the kind of thing that really electrified me when I was younger. In the student environment, I think you understand very early on, you can make a career of this kind of study. And that just means learning a tremendous amount about some cells, some molecules, but that field itself, that basic research field, it's answering really basic questions. I mean, that's sort of what the term means. It's basic science because it's asking really simple questions like, why does this thing do that thing when you do this to it? As your career gets a little bit more developed, you start encountering more complicated questions. And this is what I think you're talking about, because people tend to want to know practical answers to practical questions. If you say, I've got a scientific training in cell and molecular biology, people will probably say, oh, so if I take this medicine that I bought over the counter, will I be safe afterward? That's the kind of question asking and answering that you develop in a long career like this. So I did that for a very long time, but that kind of basic science struggles to answer really clear, practical questions like that. Um, but for the last 17 years, I've worked in this space that tries to take that really basic scientific understanding and it answers those questions in a way that governments need you to answer them. And that's a long time to be developing an awareness of what information's out there. There's a lot of it that's from animals. There's a lot that's not from animals. And I know which one gives a more predictable result now. And that's where my confidence comes from.
Just this basic research it's an important part of the research process before we can answer a more complex question like, is this chemical that I'm getting exposed to in my fish or my food going to cause cancer for me? Before we can answer questions like, is this food healthy? Will this medication make me die of a heart attack? Or will it stop me from having a heart attack? So there's many steps along the research pathway. Jeff started off and was well trained in some of these beginning phases, but learned so much more from there. And I feel like you see more of the big picture now, I feel, and I'll let you share that. And what's the most effective way for me to really make an impact with the work I'm doing and make a difference on people? And for our case as well, for animals, how can we help them all by really doing the best science?
It's a good question, and there are many answers to it that make sense. I think what you were saying is really important to reiterate. You know, it bears repeating that people, myself included, we crave answers to questions that seem very simple to us, but are in reality quite complicated questions. You know, there's not a really simple way to break down a question like, is a medicine safe, or is this chemical going to cause cancer? And that's really what's happening when we ask these questions about, you know, like what can I do to keep us safe, but also make sure that animals aren't used in experiments? There are so many steps between those 2 points. It's never an inappropriate time to look at the state of the world and to say, I feel like this could be done better. I can step forward pretty confidently and talk to people about methods that use the techniques of cell biology instead of whole animals in answering some of these really complicated questions. So maybe that's sort of the kind of flavor of what you're asking.
Now let's go a little bit more simple here and make it more real if we can. So let's say we've got a family of 4 or 5, a couple, they've got their kids. There's so much that is consumable on the news now, and it's hard to know what to believe. We've seen our government making public statements about we have to move away from animal testing. We see researchers and universities saying we can't do this. It's critical so that we have developed cures for cancer. And there's nonprofits out there which buy full space ads on TV and in major newspapers saying, thanks for your research dollars. We're able to, save this mom from breast cancer. And she's holding her little baby, for example. It's in these poignant photos. How do you know what to believe? Who are you rooting for if you're a mom or a dad who wants to be bringing up your kids in the safest environment that's going to have the most cutting edge medications available if they come down with a horrible disease? Who should you listen to? What should you be advocating for with your lawmaker? Should you be saying, yes, this push for both regulation to move away from animal testing and spending money and moving towards these non-animal methods, I want that because that's best for my family? Or are you going to listen to places like the National Primate Research Center, the handful of them that still house and experiment on monkeys, and other organizations that are saying this is the way forward. If you stop funding this, it's going to be devastating. There's almost two polarizing messages out there. I know both sides. I've seen the medicine. I've seen the real world clinical applications of treating patients and medications that have unexpected side effects almost every week in my practice. What could you share to try and help clarify for our listening audience, which might be understandably confused about which side to believe? What should they be asking for and advocating for what's best for their family?
I think everybody has to take the time that they need to ask this question in the way that they are most curious about it, and just reach out into the world of options. There's so much information out there that it's easy to be overwhelmed. Usually the best way to answer these questions is to follow where the clearest information is. If we're talking about the line of work where I'm focused most, I think trust can be very appropriately given to the parts of government that approve drugs. They don't always get it right, but over time they have a real strong interest in making sure that whatever science is best comes to be used to make decisions. We've got decades of this process underway that you can already reflect on. So just to give you an example, in the European Union, there's been a directive on the law books since 1986 that says, and I'm summarizing here, but this directive says, all things considered, we should be moving away from using animals in tests. They're not really giving us what we need in terms of information to develop new drugs and medical treatments that protect humans, but also do it in a safe way. So that law says anytime you can use a method that doesn't use animals to replace a method that you used to use that used animals, you should use it. And I think that's an easy to explain example of how, for some important authorities in the world, this is sort of settled science. It's not a mystery. It's not saying anything that
Or
is
that
dramatic.
statement is 40 years old. So this is, like you said, this is not a brand new idea by any stretch.
Nothing new. And just maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, the European Union also, they track the use of animals for scientific purposes over time. And they've just put out their most recent report on animal use trends. And by and large, animal use continues to decrease. So if animal testing worked great and it left no questions about what information came from it, we'd be having a very different conversation. But we're having the conversation that's based in this reality that when governments willfully say, we want to set this as a goal, we want everybody to recognize that moving away from animals, it's not just an ethical question, it's just a better scientific approach to answering questions about human health. You can now see what the impact of that is. Over 40 years, you start to see animal use decreasing. So if you're looking for information to make you feel like you're doing the right thing, you're protecting your family, I think you can look and see, yeah, that the medical establishment is a good one. It wants to protect you. And there are these places where you can see that this is a good component. Moving away from animal use in that process is a good component of the sort of overall trajectory toward protecting your family and yourself.
Thanks, Jeff, for helping explain that a bit, give our listeners some guidance. And the agency in the U.S. that approves or declines drugs for use that you referred to, that's the FDA, correct? Or the Food and Drug Administration?
Yeah, that's right.
And they are on record as being interested in moving away from that is the next step. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not only correct, it's also been correct for quite some time. The Food and Drug Administration, I think they get a lot of press lately because they are speaking much more vocally about this, sort of in the way that the European governments have been speaking for those 40 years. The FDA has set some targets. They're saying we'd like to move away from using primates, for instance, which is all very good, but even so, the FDA still can do better. I wouldn't say that the FDA is where I would turn to find the most forward-thinking science. And that's my polite way of saying change does not come easy. So sometimes you need people to retire and new scientific expertise to come in by simply turning over the people who are involved in making decisions. And I think the FDA is maybe a generation behind the governments in Europe on this one.
So, Jeff, what's your piece of the puzzle for all of this in trying to advance best science, moving away from animal testing? How do you help move things in the right direction here?
I don't know if I want to toot my own horn. In general, I'm happy to help any company or government or scientist who's asking the questions that you're asking right now. So I know that's very broad, but if you're a company that's making products that are pharmaceuticals or over-the-counter drugs, medical devices like pacemakers or food products, I'm your guy. I'm part of a big team that does nothing but day in and day out respond to companies who say, look, I make this drug. I've heard from the FDA or some other regulator that I need to do animal studies. Maybe I've gone to a company to help me get ready for that. I don't really like the options that are in front of me. Can you help? That's what I do. I say, yes, I can help, and here's how. Even for the biggest companies in the world that make the biggest blockbuster drugs, they still struggle. The process to get a drug approved to be sold to you and me on the market, whether we buy it from a pharmacy or we have to get a prescription, it's very long, very expensive. And 15 years, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions at this point. And in the process, companies have a hugely vested financial interest in doing whatever it takes to get the products onto the market that they've developed. And that is unfortunate because that does tend to mean that the process itself doesn't like to change. The idea is if some process worked to get a drug on the market before, we're going to do that same process again. It's reliable, it's dependable, and if that process used a lot of animals and experiments, well, that's the price of getting good science that it takes to get a drug on the market. But that's just not the case. What is
So do you
true?
agree with that statement? That sounds like we've done it before. That's the way we're always going to do it. Just because it's worked before and we've done it before, that's not enough justification to say this is the best way forward. Are you saying, it sounds to me like you're doing everything you can to squeeze the most efficiency out of a highly inefficient and slow system, as opposed to, and I'm not being critical, but another way that I look at this process as well as others, should we work the best we can with the system we have with all its flaws, or should we change the system of getting it done so that it serves more people more quickly?
You're
So
definitely
which
right. Oh no, I mean, I have to play devil's advocate a bit here because that method, that approach of what worked before will work again, it's demonstrably false. I think even the FDA themselves, they publish figures on their website that say, you know, like 90% of the drugs that go through this process that seem to be fine in animal studies ultimately fail. They don't ever make it to the market. They're either not safe enough for humans or they don't do what they say on the label. They don't actually have the benefit that they're advertising. And we don't find that out until animal tests are over and you get to human clinical trials. So ultimately, this system is terrible. It's just not great. If a company is coming to me, it's probably because they've spoken with someone else that we've worked with to help. And that's a sort of word of mouth way of finding the help you need to move away from that old method of doing things. And that's great, but it's not efficient. I say all the time, I cannot wait for the scientific endeavor at large to put me out of work. I shouldn't be here. It shouldn't take a nonprofit organization like PETA, to serve this function for companies when government agencies and companies themselves fully have the skills and talent and know how to do it. But again, it takes a strongly motivated party. So let's say a company making a drugs. At the moment, they really have to seek really good advice and they have to wear it on their sleeve. They have to say, I want to move away from using animals in studies. And that's what is still a problem in need of a solution until there's rules or incentives that say companies, if you move in this direction of modernizing the way that you develop and approve drugs, maybe you get a faster review process, or maybe there are fee reductions. Until those things are in place, and in the United States they are not in place, it'll still be advice that comes through people like me and other people who do work like I do, and we're happy to do it. But it should be something that's much more integrated into the standard scientific process.
This concept of it's not the best way, but it's the way we've always been doing it, that applies to, I think, so many areas outside of this discussion. And I'm going to share a short story here where this struck me. From 7 or 8 years ago in medical practice, there was a new orthopedic surgeon. Again, I'm an infectious disease doctor, so I see orthopedic surgeons' patients when they go bad, when they get infected. And so there was a new orthopedic surgeon who joined a group, and he was older than I was, in the category of old school, which doesn't have to be bad, but it's got a bad reputation sometimes for a reason. But I was very surprised because I've been working with the current orthopedic group all the time, handling their knee infections, their hip infections, which are kind of two of the common ones. And I know what the wounds look like after even these surgical therapies where you have to clean out infection. And the first time I saw this surgeon's wound after an infection, I was just shocked. It went from mid-thigh to a number of inches below the knee, which looked nothing like all the other incisions I had seen for the last number of years practicing. I asked some of his colleagues, because I'm not a surgeon. I am not one to challenge what the best way to make an incision is or exactly where to make the cut. My suspicions were right, is that this guy was practicing medicine from 20 years ago in this hospital. And when challenged in what I would say a non-confrontational way, as the non-surgeon, I said, I've never seen an incision like this to treat a wound like this. He said, well, that's the way I've been doing it since I started 30 years ago. And it works for me. And I couldn't argue with him because I had never really made incisions and cleaned them up, but every other orthopedic surgeon could. And so that I thought of that when you were telling me about this process, which is, it's been done before. It does work, but it's hardly the most efficient. It's hardly in the best interest of everybody involved. It costs an awful lot of money. And in this surgeon example, not unlike the patients today waiting for treatments that are failing in animal trials, this patient suffers by having an incision going from their mid-thigh to well below their knee, and all the risks associated with a larger incision, like difficulty healing, infection, when it could have been potentially 3 arthroscopic incisions, which is standard of care for a lot of these, or if not, a very small incision, which is what I've seen and observed as a non-surgeon. So my point is, status quo is not good enough. Tradition is not good enough for continuing it. And status quo beyond what Jeff is talking about in medicine, if you're an electrician, if you clean a pool, whatever it is, just because it's been done before does not mean it's the best, most efficient way to go forward.
Yeah, there's that phrase about conventional wisdom. People do trust conventional wisdom, but I don't know if you feel the same way. If I put all of the people who I know into a room and I wonder what the conventional wisdom in that room is about really specialized things like surgery and medical treatment, I don't want conventional wisdom. I want whoever is the most wise and experienced person in there. And to your point, this is such a good way to bring up that the process for this, like the process for training people and how to do this science, how to develop new medicines, the process for getting these medicines onto the market, none of this was built intentionally. It's all cobbled together, kind of in a rush, and none of those different systems play together at all. And this does leave us in a strange position that, I mean, I'll even give you my version of a quick lesson, which is to say that drugs themselves, like pharmaceuticals, they've not been around for very
Oh,
long.
I'm just going to interrupt. That surgeon didn't last very long at that hospital. He was,
It's good to know.
his contract was not renewed. And so, yeah, he moved on. He says, yeah, you can continue doing the same thing you did in the 1980s somewhere else. Sorry, go ahead.
But I think, if the conventional wisdom were capable of saying that too about not just, surgeons, but about the way drugs get approved, my goodness, we'd be in a better position. We've only really had medicines in the way we think about them for a little over 100 years. Like the first Nobel Prize for medicine that went to what we would call a pharmaceutical was in 1906. And it became very apparent very quickly that it's just as capable for these new medicines to harm people, right? So early antibiotics are a classic example. At the right dose, they can cure you of a bacterial infection. At the wrong dose, they can destroy your liver and you die. And this is a complicated problem. There's something that we need to take that can heal us and harm us at the same time. And very quickly, laws were written in different countries to say, this is terrifying. What do we do? And all of the different tests that were sort of grabbed at that moment were simply tests that were available then. So they said, like, how do we know if this is going to irritate skin? Grab a rabbit, put some on a rabbit skin. Does it cause irritation? No one today would say that that was a good way to design a skin irritation test. And we have many better tests now that don't use animals at all. They use computers or they use human cells and culture. They use all sorts of things that give us really confident answers. And that's great because now we're in an era where all of these modern tools are being developed really rapidly, but the laws can't keep up. The law wants to hold on to these old systems, and that's, I think, where we are. At the point of work for everyone is a recognition that these aren't decisions that only get to be made by pharmaceutical companies or by people who work at the FDA. Everybody has the right to say, I want a better system. You can strengthen your voice by finding groups that have a voice that you think is missing and participating in it. It's this sort of amplification of these voices that we use to make sure that the people in Congress in the United States, but the people in politics in general, recognize that people want a change. And I think it's not an easy question to answer, but this does get to your point. There's not like a surgical review board for how drugs are approved. The next best thing is changing the laws that tell the FDA and other government agencies how to do what they do.
In terms of modifying it and working it within the system, that's sticking within the administrative side, within the executive branch, FDA, Department of Health and Human Services, tweaking it versus Congress writing a law that says, this is the way it's going to be done going forward, and here's the way it's going to be implemented. They're going to designate organizations to promulgate rules, for example, for coming up with a new plan. That's a very heavy lift, as we all know, an extremely heavy lift, whereas tweaking it here and there, which is what's being done literally for decades, that's the easier way to get past the immediate problem, but not fixing the big one. And I'm kind of thought of another example recently. So when the FDA came out with these animal testing requirements in the 1930s or so, this was not even a thought, right? NAMS, the idea that we're going to have better technologies, a better way to do it before getting to trials was not even imaginable. It was, we have animals or nothing, so let's do animals. And over time, it's evolved so that we have a patchwork with different organizations coming up with different rules. And now we have this horribly complex system such that even the drug makers need help getting through the process. And so I'm reminded of my parents, and they have an 18-year-old vehicle that has about over 200,000 miles on it. It's had numerous repairs. You can imagine how many tire changes and tire rotations, oil changes. It's been through a number of accidents. It's had windshield replaced. It's had so many things done to it. And it was in another collision not too long ago. And I was having the discussion trying to say maybe it's time to let it go and get a brand new vehicle. And can you imagine just the technology and the safety features and the comfort compared with a vehicle from, 2008 or so? It's in 2008, you could not have imagined what a 2026 motor vehicle looks like. I think that those are similar, and they've got a different mindset than me. They were patched up the fender bender, and maybe the sun visor doesn't work and it's too old to replace it, and the rear view mirror is partially falling off, and we're gonna put it back up with duct tape and keep driving this vehicle, which has long outlived its life expectancy, but it's continuing to be drivable. And so you can continue to squeeze as much out of the current system, which you have invested a lot in. At some point, it's time to put it to rest and come up with something better. And
at some point, you just got to let it go.
Some point, you got to let it go, and or not. So I just thought that was relevant. Maybe that'll resonate with someone, because I feel like that maybe it's not an exact analogy, Jeff, but I feel there's a lot of similarities with working basically with the same system from 1938 with a lot of tweaks along the way, to the point that now it's really animal testing it's really as outdated as 1938.
I mean,
you squeeze a little bit of information out of it, but at a great cost.
I would say it's a pretty apt analogy, and I think you've used a good one. I often give a similar analogy to phones. I mean, phones change so much over time that if your laptop failed at this point, maybe a phone could honestly do better than it. It's that level of change. No more are people really wondering, like, can we actually move away from animal studies? Now the question is, all right, clearly we need to be moving in this way, but my goodness, the old ones are sort of stuck in place. And one of the real problems in solving this issue is that there's this mindset that if you grabbed one of these animal tests off of the shelf from the 1930s, it probably didn't do what it says very well. It's like, it's a messy test, let's say. But now if you have a precise new 2026 all-electric vehicle, it's probably very tightly optimized. It works really well. You know how much you're going to get out of a single charge. But in order to swap it out for the old thing, you've got to show that the new thing does exactly what the old thing did. So you're sort of being asked to like dumb down the new car. And we wouldn't do that. And if we were talking about cars, we wouldn't say, okay, that's great. You've got a 2026 all electric vehicle. But all the rules say your car has to get 32 miles per gallon. So now you need a combustion engine. You just tack it on. And that sounds silly, but this really is where we are. This is the way science is struggling with the laws that tell companies how to get drugs on the market. It's a problem within the FDA itself that maintains that this is the kind of way that they want to solve problems. The FDA was created by laws, and it's just as modifiable by laws now as it was when it was created, and as recently as last November, when the Congress passed the appropriations laws. There were at least 3 requests that Congress made to the government saying, we need you to start putting out an annual report showing us that you're actually moving away from animal studies. You talk about it a lot, FDA, but we don't actually see a lot of numbers. You're not telling us the facts about this, and we'd like to see that in reports now. So that's just one example, but that's something that's moving. I think you see that the engine of change comes from many places. It's not a single switch that you can flip, but I have high hopes that that engine of change is now including more than just, hoping that the FDA feels like moving forward into the future, making some of these changes. I feel much better when companies know, when Congress knows, when people listening to this podcast know that you can make a couple of calls, whether it's to your elected officials or to a nonprofit that's doing work that you like, or to a company whose products you use. You can make your voice known and you can say, I heard about this animal replacement thing. Are you working on that? And as insignificant as that has often felt when I've done it, it has worked, right? It results in change. And if that's what we've got right now, I hope everybody feels like maybe this is a very big problem, but you can work on really local, important to you solutions every single day in small ways, and it helps.
Lawmakers are starting to see this. They they work for you. It doesn't feel like that a lot of the time, perhaps, but ultimately they get elected or not based on their constituents. And so you do have a voice. Jeff, where can people go to learn a little bit more about this if this has intrigued them and they want to learn more about outdated animal tests and struggles within the FDA for approval and learn a little bit at least about all the promise of NAMs? Is there one good place or a couple of suggestions you might have for where they can go so that they can then speak to their lawmaker and advocate for what they feel is most important to them and their family?
Yeah, I think it can be quite technical, but the PETA Science Consortium International is a really good place. That's if you need some advice, like if you're a drug maker or you're talking to one and you want to know how to talk to them about that sort of thing. There's plenty of information there, but PETA.org also, you can go and they've divided up areas where you can get more information by topics. So there's an entire area about animals for experimentation that gives you much more than you would ever hope for to answer some more questions about this. I think those are probably two really easy off the top of my head suggestions.
I wound up on their site as well, and I can speak as a consumer and someone who wants to learn. We have this convoluted, complex system which has been added on to since the 1930s. Maybe we need something completely different because we have science, which is completely different from the 1930s. Um, yeah, it's how much of medicine is the same as in the post-World War II area, and that's even after the 1930s. How much is the same? It's almost unrecognizable. And so just looking at it from a really big picture, should we really be relying on approval methods for getting drugs passed based on data crafted in the 1930s? Just doesn't make sense to me. And I feel as a consumer of medications, you should be asking for more. Jeff, I've learned a lot listening to you. I'm so thankful for this work that you're doing, getting from I have an idea for a drug and the process to make it happen to getting it FDA approved. That process in the middle is really complex and costly. So you're helping go from idea to actual drug, and that's just great. We need dedicated, smart people like you helping make that work. I thank you for that. So any closing remarks, Jeff?
Much obliged. I think if anybody who's listening is interested, you do not have to be a scientist to make meaningful change here. So thanks for the chat and have a great one.
Keep listening, keep learning, keep asking questions, and make informed decisions for what's best for you and your family. Thanks so much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening. These conversations aren't always easy, but they matter, and they're worth having. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more information, videos, and updates at johnliebermanmd.com. Take what resonates, ask questions, and keep learning. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical or legal advice and does not replace speaking with a qualified professional. Always seek guidance specific to your situation.